Hey everyone, I have a fun interview to bring with you today. I have two amazing women and they are very inspiring, and they have actually taken upon themselves to come together and create Save Women's Sports Australasia. And they have been doing a lot of boots on the ground work. Katherine Deves, Ro Edge. Kath, you want to start us out with a little introduction about yourself?
Hi everybody, so my name's Katherine Deves. I live in Sydney. I have three little girls who do 7 sports between them over the course of the school year.
Oh,
So
wow.
we're very heavily involved in sport. I'm a lawyer, and I
Let's
started,
highlight that a little bit, girl. Wow.
so 6 years of study with three little children, and I've finally been admitted to the New South Wales Supreme Court. And last year, we joined forces here in Australia with the women in New Zealand who'd already set up Save Women's Sports New Zealand because we were starting to have issues with sports policy over here. So we joined forces to create Save Women's Sports Australasia. Now, Australia, we are behind the 8 ball. We've had a lot of policy implemented already. Fortunately, New Zealand was a little bit behind us, so they were watching us like the canary in the coal mine to see what was going to happen. And because our countries are so similar, we've been able to work together in terms of fighting this.
That's awesome. Ro, take it away. Let them know a bit about you.
Yeah, right. So I'm Ro Edge, and I initially started Save Women's Sport in New Zealand probably, about 18 months ago, I guess. And that was started because we saw the issues that were happening in Australia and overseas. And at that stage, there weren't any trans inclusion policies really developed in New Zealand. So we thought it was our chance to get ahead of the 8 ball and start contacting sporting organisations and Sport New Zealand to see what inroads we could make about protecting women's sport. So I had a daughter who was on a college scholarship over in the States in North Carolina, but unfortunately she had to come back due to COVID, and she decided not to go back just because it was just so unknown. But I've also got a niece who was in the Olympic cycling team for New Zealand. So sports is something that our family are incredibly passionate about, and protecting females' rights to participation and competition and podium positions is something we're all really passionate about as well. So yeah, and so I met Kath through the amazing Senator Claire Chandler from Tasmania, who is like the most incredible politician who is not scared to speak out on these issues. And
She is so incredible. Yeah, let's give her all the credit we can. I've never seen such a fierce woman in government, and it's really inspired me to keep pushing forward over here. I think all of our courage inspires each other. It's awesome. But yeah, so it's amazing. I'm glad that you've all come together, and we've had Senator Claire Chandler on one of our webinars before. It was incredible.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that she's going to inspire some New Zealand politicians to start speaking up soon. And I have a couple that I'm working on, so fingers crossed. But yeah, but she's amazing. So she introduced me to Kath, and that's how we decided, look, we're both fighting the same battle. We're coming at it from slightly different, where we're at with it, but it's the same battle. We have similar kind of government systems. So let's just work together. And I think it's been really valuable.
Yeah, strength in numbers for sure, right?
Mm.
Well, I'm so glad that you guys came together and took it upon yourselves, because that's what it's going to take, is this grassroots effort of everyone just doing what they can, where they can, and that will be enough. Women just have to put our stake in the ground. And I'm glad there are politicians like Claire that see that it extends so much farther than sports. This is an absolute erasure of women's rights, and we just happened to be a little ahead of the game, ladies, to see that it was eroding out from underneath our feet, right? Everything that we've fought for. And so I think that's another thing that I want to really hit home with this interview, is that we all feel like we're average women, right? And that we didn't necessarily feel we could make a difference when we started, but we knew that we had to speak up and we had to use our voice where we could, and look where it got us. And I hope it inspires all of you out there to use your voice, like, even if it shakes, because mine still does, even when I'm out there testifying for all these states. But it is so important. These government officials are sick of listening to lobbyists and the same old people. They want to hear your story. They want to have that personal touch to things, and we all can make a really big impact. And we don't have to be lawyers, but it certainly helps.
Indeed.
Kath, you've had some really exciting things go on in this last week. Can you let everyone know what you just got done accomplishing?
So I was a witness at my first parliamentary inquiry, and absolutely I was sitting there thinking, I am the mother of 3 little girls. I live in the burbs. How on earth did I get here? Showing up to New South Wales Parliament House as an invited guest, and sitting at the table testifying for some legislation they're trying to push through. So this is actually quite a broad piece of legislation where they want to ban the teaching of, they term it gender fluidity, but essentially it's gender identity ideology in schools. So I listened to all the testimony of the other witnesses, and then it's recorded into a document that we call Hansard. And what struck me was the difference in the quality of testimony. So on our side, you have a lot of science and reason and discussion about human rights, ethics, etc. And on the other side, it's a lot of hurt feelings and hyperbole and emotional displays. It's almost like that conversations at cross purposes. But one thing that really struck me was out of the 80 submissions that were made, and I think there were about 20 different witnesses, there was only a couple of others that considered little girls and considered women at all, and what gender identity ideology means. Nobody else really mentioned sports. And as we know, if you're across this issue, that allowing gender identity to take precedence over biological sex has real material impacts for girls and women. And we're talking about gender identity in schools. We all know how important sport is at school, how important it is to participate. We know that we have a huge level of attrition from young girls when they hit puberty. We know that if we can get them through to about the age of 14, over those first years of puberty, they'll often stick with it. We know how important it is for the positive knock-on effects throughout the rest of their lives. And I just was struck at the fact that no one seemed to be talking about it. So when I was asked to be a witness, I was very grateful and terrified to be able to be someone who could stand up on behalf of our little girls and our young girls at school. So I did. I did my best. I knew that my opening statement was going to be really important, because on the panel there were a few people after watching the testimony prior to me who were sympathetic to our point of view. There were a couple of politicians who were incredibly hostile, and I had been prepared to be attacked by them. My strategy was to ask them the standalone question. I really wanted to get them on the spot with that. What I wasn't prepared for was to be completely ignored, to be dismissed, and for one of them to sit on his phone throughout my testimony, to be talking to each other while myself and the other witnesses were talking. It was very dismissive and rude. And I think that sort of exemplified how the other side treat us when we come out with our opinions. The people who were sympathetic were wonderful. They were very welcoming, and they spoke to me afterwards and very supportive. Yeah, so that was a really worthwhile experience. And one thing that we do with parliamentary inquiries here is that you can be asked questions on notice. So that means that you can go away and answer the question more fully. Any of the panelists can submit more detailed questions to you, and you have 21 days to respond. So I've received a list of further questions from the panelists, so I will get the opportunity to get our position onto the record, which I did not really have the opportunity to do with the testimony. So it is a really good first step for us. It's opened the conversation. It's brought it to the parliamentary table. So the politicians are going to have to acknowledge it, and they're going to have to talk about it. And up to this point, at our state legislature, it's pretty much been all one way, and no one's been listening to women. So
that sounds like an incredible step forward. We usually aren't given a seat at the table to even join the conversation. So it's
Hmm.
incredible to know that now it's going to be on record too,
Hmm.
which is an awesome thing because our history is being erased before our eyes. So we have to take it
And,
back.
and I also put on the record in relation to risk of injury and concussion and things like that. So essentially, the Parliament's now on notice. So if and when, I think it's more like when, a girl does get injured or has life-ending injuries, we can refer back and say, you were warned. We
Yeah,
told you.
we told you we were here. They can't say,
Yeah.
well, where were they? We were
Yeah.
here. And that's another thing that I'd like to tell other people, like, what will you be telling future
Hmm.
generations you did to save their
Yes.
rights?
Yeah.
Kath, I'm sure you look down at your daughters and see, like,
Hmm.
this isn't right. I have to do something. And I hope everyone can have that connection. We even have grandmas playing sports still and needing sex separated spaces. And it extends all ages, and I hope everyone can see that it's going to affect everyone in our lives, and women are now are the majority of the world, and it's crazy that we're listening to facts over feelings when it comes to this in this tiny minority, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting stories from young girls and also mothers who are very distressed. There are now, the way the policy is set up here is that a boy can register as a female and it has to remain confidential. So clearly he's male, and they're taking the prizes. They're taking
Yeah,
the spots on
and
the
you're seeing what
podium.
we've seen in the United States, and so that's why we're introducing all these bills now too, is they've sneakily come in there and made these things so that they're able to compete without us knowing.
And yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to mention Associate Professor Dr. Holly Lawford Smith started a website called noconflicttheysaid.org. It's now being managed by LGB Alliance because she was inundated. But this is a
True,
place where
yes.
women can share their stories of how they're being impacted by gender identity policies, because the governments aren't collating any
Yeah,
data. They've put all
I'll put that link in the description for everyone. It's a website that you can go and you can give your story if you have been impacted by the ideology.
yeah, in any area of life, not just
Yeah.
sport.
Yeah,
Um,
jobs, anything.
but there are stories there, obviously, from sports, and some of them are heartbreaking. Like, as you mentioned, older women playing AFL, community exercise, and then all of a sudden you have a man interject himself, and everyone has to pretend that he's a woman. And these women are completely demoralized, they're frightened, they're self-excluding. And the governments aren't collating the data. So they put the policies in place, and usually they'd have a mechanism in place to assess the efficacy, any unintended consequences. But here, there's nothing. So Holly started the website, and of course, she has come under significant fire for that, which I think just proves how important it is. But yeah, we're starting to see the real world implications, and it's girls and women who are paying the price.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's sad, but grateful that we have women like you, and hopefully we can encourage more women to stand up. Ro, you've also got some cool stuff going on over there. Give us an
Well,
update.
seen some interesting things happen. So you might recall when World Rugby brought out their trans inclusion guidelines last year, the New Zealand Rugby Union rejected them, which was really heartbreaking, especially because they had asked their female rugby players, their elite rugby players, whether they should adopt them or not. And they'd said yes, and they ignored that because they felt that they didn't understand the policy properly. So, which I just found mind-boggling. So what they did, they set about developing their own transgender policy
Okay.
and worked with our Sport New Zealand, which is our overall sporting organisation. And so Sport New Zealand said, look, we'll help you develop your trans inclusion policy, but we'll also develop guiding principles for all our other sports so we can help them. So New Zealand Rugby had hoped to have their policy enacted before the community rugby season started. The draft hasn't even come out, and the community rugby season started about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So they've hit a few curveballs, I think, just through going through a proper process. They did consult, we were consulted with at the end of last year. But I think there's a couple of reasons where they've probably hit some roadblocks. The first is in New Zealand, you genuinely cannot sue for injury against somebody. So we have what's called Accident Compensation Corporation. And so what that does is that funds basically anyone who has sporting injuries. It covers 80% of their wages and their recuperation costs, basically. And so because of that, they have quite a big influence in terms of sporting rules and ensuring the health and safety of players. So we'd got in touch with ACC when all of this kicked off, when we understood that New Zealand Rugby Union were going to be, and Sport New Zealand were going to be developing these policies, and said, you need to be at the table. This is really, really important given the increased level of risk to female athletes if they play males. And then I think the other thing is England Rugby's transgender policies also muddied the waters. I don't know if you saw that when it came out recently, but they have basically got this draft policy where they're restricting biological males playing female rugby, those that are either under 90 kgs and they've got to be less than 170 centimetres tall. You know, anyone over those apparently has to be assessed by a coach, which puts a whole lot of pressure on coaches and clubs to try and, because imagine if they reject somebody, they're probably going to be called transphobes and bigots and all the rest.
Yeah, we're seeing the disaster this is setting them up for.
Yeah, and it makes it really hard for small clubs to manage that. And it will actually put people off being involved with clubs if they feel like that conflict is going to come. And it's hard enough for sporting clubs now to get volunteers. It is.
And we're seeing it here in the United States. We're not getting coaches and referees the same because they are afraid to speak up about the males competing on female sports, or they're getting pushed out when they do.
Yeah, or they can't even question if a boy walks into a girl's changing room anymore because they're not allowed.
Legal. Yeah,
right, exactly. But you know, you look at the English policy, and it's just stupid anyway, because we know that height and weight are only two factors of the biological performance advantage that men have. But the average woman weighs 70 kgs, and the average height's about 164 centimetres, I think. So these guys are already going to be on the high side. So over the past 6 months, we've put a number of Official Information Act requests into Sport New Zealand to see if we can find out what's been happening behind the scenes. And they rejected all of ours to begin with because it was just, they didn't want to put anyone at risk of being targeted by us, I suppose. But recently somebody had a successful request and they sent us 200 pages of information, and it was actually quite mind-blowing. And what it showed is last year we did a massive letter writing campaign to all the sporting organisations, well, a lot of them, around New Zealand, across the board from grassroots level right through to regional and national level. And it seems that all our letter writing actually stopped Sport New Zealand enacting a trans inclusion policy that they had not consulted with the public at all on, going live on their website. Like, they were about a week away from launching this. When they got, even our Minister of Sport basically forwarded a letter that we'd sent to a sporting organisation to them and said, you know, you need to deal with this. But they were getting hundreds, like they said they were overwhelmed with sporting organisations asking how they dealt with this issue, and they were all really nervous about it. So I think we can be proud of the fact that we stopped that bloody policy happening, because it basically said that you weren't, a person's biological sex had to remain confidential, and that people could play in whatever sex category they wanted, whichever they identified with. So we were so close to that happening. So where we are now is we're still waiting for the draft policies to come out, but we've got some other interesting things happening in New Zealand too. For instance, the government wants to push through sex self-ID legislation. So they introduced that by stealth in the parliamentary process, and so now all they have to do is go to a second and third reading, and they had a majority, so they could push it through. So we're campaigning really, really hard to make sure there's public consultation on that, so people can understand the ramifications of it, because it will have a big impact on sports, but on, you know, changing rooms and toilets and all the rest of it as well.
Right, and I'll put the links for Speak Up for Women in the
so there's a petition that we've got running. So if anyone from New Zealand is watching, like, please sign the petition. It's just simply to ask to consult. We're not saying stop it, we're saying consult. So you
just want to see it at the table, right? We just want to be heard, a civil conversation.
Exactly.
Too often we're just screamed at with vile language and attacks, personal attacks. It's like that's all they have left, because they know we're standing in the truth and how much power that has. So they just try to personally attack you to shut you up. We're not standing for it.
Yeah, well, another way the government's trying to shut us up is they're trying to introduce hate speech legislation, and gender identity will be protected. And we've got our Human Rights Commission, that now a woman is anyone who identifies as such, and even a lesbian now is a biological male or female who identifies as a woman who's attracted to a woman who may be a biological male or female. I mean, for God's sake, homosexuality is same-sex attracted. and they're conflating sex with gender all over the place, and it's making a complete nightmare for for so many different issues. It's mind-boggling,
Yeah, it's a
really.
good time to point out how we need to be so clear with the language, because that's how they've gotten as far as they've had, is they've conflated sex and gender identity, and they've played on women's niceness to sneak this through. And we really
Yeah,
need to be
far too
clear
long.
how when we include gender identity along with sex, it basically erases the definition of the sexes. And like you said, it allows anyone to claim womanhood. Because it's the
Yeah,
truth. We are what we are. We're male or female, and that's our biological sex.
yeah,
Well, they took the biological definitions of man and woman out of our Sex Discrimination Act back in 2013 when they inserted gender identity. But there are moves afoot to make amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act because of the scandals that have been coming out of our federal parliament in relation to sexual harassment in the workplace. There's a young staffer who alleges she was raped by another staffer, and that higher ups knew, and so on. So they want to make some amendments. So this might actually be an opportunity for us to campaign to have those biological definitions reinserted, and also to have further protections for sports. Hang on.
Because what this does with inserting gender identity instead of sex, it takes away a woman's right to say that sex discrimination is happening.
This is a really good opportunity for us to campaign to have the definitions reinserted and to fortify our sex protections, because the policies in relation to sports in Australia, the way they've written the legislation is it says that you can't be discriminated against on the basis of sex and gender identity. So by doing that, it puts them in direct conflict, because if you've got a situation where you've got a teenage girl who's signed up for single sex cricket, say, that's what she anticipates that it's going to be when she shows up. But then you've got a boy who's registered as a female, and they want to exclude him, but he's saying, well, you're discriminating against me on the basis of my gender identity. And she's saying, well, if he's allowed to play, you're discriminating against me on the basis of my sex. So
It's just a circular, it just doesn't make any sense.
who takes precedence? So the way the institutions here have interpreted the legislation is they've interpreted it in favour of gender identity. So we have an example here of a sports club where we've got one girl. Sorry, just take a step back. So with the sports legislation here, you can exclude on the basis of sex and gender identity when children reach the age of 12 on the basis of strength, stamina, and physique if they are relevant. And so I'll go back. And then we have an older teenage girl who's playing at the same club in a single sex competition and wanted to have confirmation that it would only be females playing in that competition, and they refused to give it. So we're getting shafted at both ends.
Oh my God.
I know, right? So this is
ridiculousness of that is just unbelievable.
Yeah,
the same club.
Yep, the same club. So as I've heard through the grapevine. So I'm hoping that the girls who are being affected are actually going to escalate this to some sort of a complaint or one of our discrimination tribunals. So hopefully we have some brave girls and their mums who are willing to step up and do that, because we need to start doing that here in Australia.
We need to start doing that across the world, and we're really looking for that in America too. More girls to step up, more moms to say we've had enough, and it's just what it's going to take, because this is an issue of awareness. Until it hits home for you, you don't really see. And so if it is hitting home for you, please hit us up. We're going to have our emails in the bottom. Don't be afraid to use your voice, and don't be afraid to reach out. We can help you if you want to get to that point of testifying. There'll be plenty of support for you. Just don't be afraid, because it is so empowering to speak up, isn't it, ladies?
Absolutely. And I think so many people are afraid, and we know that if these young girls do speak up, they might be kicked off the team or they get ostracized, and no one wants to be the person who's shunned. But then everyone's talking behind closed doors and most people are in agreement. You know, when I go to any of the 7 sports that my daughters play and talking to the other parents,
It's a
even some of the,
no-brainer, right?
yeah,
It's
and so many
everybody
people
knows
aren't,
the truth.
and so many people aren't aware still
Like I
in
said,
Australia.
yeah,
So
it's an
many
issue
parents.
of awareness. It's really been under the covers, behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm,
These
But
rules
that's
have
because
been
our
made.
media refuses to talk about it as well. The media
mm-hmm.
will not tackle any of the issues at all. It's all got to be really positive. If it has anything to do with trans ideology, it's got to be super positive, or they will not touch it because they're
Or
all
if you're
scared
doing
of
work
being
like
called.
me, it gets put in like in the headline as a trans ban. And they don't really see
Yeah,
that we're not banning anyone from sports. We're just saying that people need to play by their sex and not by their identity,
no,
because
but you have organisations like the ACLU who are totally dishonest with all of their headlines as well, where they
Mm-hmm.
call it a trans ban and trans exclusion, but
yeah,
it's not. No one's
the
excluding
the
anyone from
bold lies, the
sport.
basic
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting, basically they're using these psychological tactics, and it just is just absurd to me how people can comply with these lies like it's not a big deal. I was recently testifying in Texas, and I'm going to put the link to the video below, of a legislator who has a Harvard education trying to mansplain to the audience that there are 6 biological sexes. So
Yeah.
then I only have, yeah, I am like, I'm getting physically ill, honestly, sitting in this crowd going, what? And I have 2 minutes to testify. So I basically had to erase part of my testimony to fit in clarifying this dude's lies. And it's just astonishing to me that we don't have more people standing up, but I think it is a matter of awareness, and we are together creating a space that is safe for people to speak up, and we are seeing more athletes speaking up in the United States. And I think we're warriors. We've been at it a while. Sometimes it's hard for us to see that it is really becoming a mainstream issue. We are getting some more coverage, and when we're not getting coverage, we're making our own coverage, like the Save Women's Sports YouTube channel, so we can get our opinions out there and show women that it's okay. And, in the end, it is sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Like, it is just some name calling, and we need to get over that and put our stake in the ground. Women won't be erased.
Yeah, isn't it
Mm-hmm.
ironic that Biden's executive order, the Equality Act, has actually highlighted the issue more than anything else probably has ever done? So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, he had 2 big executive orders, one on the first day of office, which basically inserted gender identity with sex anywhere, and another on International Women's Day of all days that inserted gender identity into Title IX, which is basically America's law that protects equal opportunities for girls. So that was enacted in 1972, and sports still aren't equal for girls, but yet we're giving these spots that are made for girls to boys, basically on a silver platter, and calling them brave and courageous along the way. But this law was supposed to give girls the opportunity that if there wasn't a girls' team, to compete on the boys' team. And it wasn't meant to go the other way around. Like, we know that it's
Mm-hmm.
not fair for boys to compete on girls' teams. It wasn't made for that. It was made to give equal opportunities to girls, because we didn't have it and we still don't have it. And now we're handing away what we have. It is just so absurd.
Well, I've had some interesting pushback in relation to that equality piece, where you get men's rights activists basically laughing at you and saying, well, you asked for equality, this is what you get, men in girls' sports. And I'm like, asking for equal opportunity under the law and for the opportunity to play on an equal playing field, and for a woman to play on an equal playing field with men, we need to take into consideration the biological differences between men and women is not the same as saying men and women are exactly the same.
Yeah, they like to throw that at us, huh? Or
Yeah.
they often, those men will say, well, where are the feminists? And it's like, well, they're screaming.
Yeah.
They've been mad. They're getting censored. What can we do here? when women are getting their Twitter accounts taken away for basically saying, but a man can't be a woman, what are we going to do? This day and age, social media is where it's at. How else do you get your message out there? I hope it's easy for people to see how we are being censored.
Mhm.
Straight up, we are being bullied into silence. We are the silenced majority, but we're not going to take it anymore.
And while we've had a lot of support here from, I guess, what people call the conservative or right-wing media, they've been really good. So Sky News and also The Australian, Bernard Lane down there, who deserves a journalism award for his dedication to this cause.
Been amazing.
So then we get accused of being on the right, whereas, you know, our position is this is
Right, we're
sports.
painted the same over
Yeah.
here. Yeah, that just because we are talking with anyone we can, and that happens to be the right more often, doesn't mean you can paint us as right wingers. I've often thrown into this box that I must be some right wing conservative Christian person. And for the record, like, I'm not a religious person. I don't hold party ties. I wasn't involved with politics before all of this. And a lot of us are the same way. We come from all different backgrounds here to come together on this. And we don't have to play some kind of political purity game where I'm not going to play with them because they believe in this and this and this. We can all come together on this without agreeing on everything, right? Because I think even in between us, we don't agree on many things. But we don't even talk about that. This is what we're standing together for, is to protect women. And that's what it's about. And we don't have to get pulled into the weeds on these other things, because we aren't as strong when we get divided, and they see that. And so I hope we inspire women to come together and join our team.
Yeah, but it's always ironic when they accuse us of getting funded by the far right, even though we don't get any funding. Some money would be really nice, but
I was just about to say my shoestring budget for Save Women's Sports would sure like a boost.
Like it's
not quite sure.
Organization that, you know, we self-fund in a lot of instances. Like we have very, very little funding, but they are happy to take money from the far left, and that's just okay. But, you know,
I mean, let's touch base on that. There's millions and millions, probably billions of dollars being spent to force this ideology, this craziness down our throats. I'm sure craziness isn't the most PC word. I'm going to cut that out. They're trying to force this ideology down our throats. They're spending millions, billions of dollars. And here we are. So, you know, I started SaveWomenSports.com with my own money. I'm very grateful that now we have donations that are helping me pay for gas money and plane tickets. But it's still a struggle. We're still putting in hours and hours of unpaid volunteer work, or paying our own gas money, like some of my testifiers did. They drove hours in Texas or drove hours in North Carolina to get there. We're all going to have to make some sacrifices if this is going to work, because it is somewhat like a David and Goliath thing here.
It is very much so.
Save Women's Sports has maybe spent thousands in their budget total, going to all these places and making laws, and they've spent millions, and look where we are and what we've done so far. So we're tipping the scales, and they can't ignore us anymore.
So is it 31 or 32 states now?
I think we are up to 32 or 33.
Wow.
I'm ashamed not to know the total count, but things have been just so chaotic for me lately. I have too many irons in the fire. It's over 30, and it's over 70 pieces of legislation. So that means the different chambers have introduced bills. They're really working hard to push this through, and it is a nonpartisan thing. We can see now over half the states are, you know, doing this, and it is a hands across the aisle moment. Like I said, it's not a political purity game. We're just trying to protect women. This isn't coming from hate. This isn't being anti-transgender or transphobic. This isn't even really about trans people at all. This is just about biology. This is about the truth that humans are dimorphic, and there are variants of that. But those aren't extra sexes. That doesn't make 6 sexes just because there are disorders of sexual development like Klinefelter syndrome and whatnot. All we need to do is provide that clarity for everyone.
And sports transcends race, culture, language, religion. That's the point, you know, with the Olympics, all of that is set to the side, and it's all about, you know, our elite athletes who've sacrificed so much to get to where they are, and to watch what the limits of human endurance are, and, you know, the cream of the crop.
So yeah,
Oh,
sports are a really powerful thing across the world. I often kind of say sports are like a religion here in the United States because people follow them so closely. And I think this ideology has caught on to that um, far before we did, that if they win in sports, they can win in society, sort of a thing. And so sports is kind of the spearhead of this issue, unfortunately. And we're
mhm.
just going to have to stand our ground and make people aware that it is just the tip of a serious issue. Like, it's what we're seeing, it's the tip of the iceberg, right? There's so much below it, that and that's what's going to sink the ship.
But we've also
Well,
got to preserve the integrity of women's sport as well, because if
mhm.
it becomes a bloody joke to watch because, you know, there's a biological male competing, then people are going to stop watching it. And we're only just starting to get an uptake of viewership in women's
Yeah.
sport. And it's really important. If, you know, we want to get equity in women's sport, and especially in terms of pay, then we need it to be really watchable, to be really competitive, and to be really fair, so people actually enjoy watching the competition of it. But
There
yeah,
needs to be a reason to have ticket prices to be able to pay athletes. And yeah, you're right, it's going to get to a point that who's going to want to watch when it just becomes this joke of a
yeah,
bunch
when
of
it,
males
yeah.
competing on the female teams. That's not what we signed up to watch. That's not what they signed up to play. And we need to reiterate how a lot of these athletes basically have a gag order. They are bullied into silence. I know an athlete who is a cyclist that got Jennifer Wagner Asali. She was told she couldn't speak out. Her whole team would lose their sponsorship. Like, it's
Wow.
just incredible. Like, you're
We had
talking
a,
about
we had a,
athletes that pay their own way, talking about
yeah,
average wives and moms who just have a passion, and all of a
Mhm.
sudden then they don't get their equipment. What can you
yeah.
do? You're
We
really
had a
just
New
stuck.
Zealand mountain biker who basically she was winning the downhill mountain biking. I think she was #2 in the world, and a trans athlete like competed as a male up until the end of one year. And the beginning of the next year,
Just
came
went
over to the
straight in
girls
there.
division and basically took out the competitions. And her father was a coach as well, and they both complained. And New Zealand Cycling just said, well, she just needs to try harder.
Yeah,
Like,
it's really
seriously,
unfair.
she was slaughtered on social media and then told by New Zealand Cycling that she just needed to try harder. It was
Just
so
like these
insulting.
girls in Connecticut have been told. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
unfortunately, I think I saw before we got on here that the case was dismissed in Connecticut,
Oh,
Oh,
that there
no.
wasn't enough proof, basically, is what the judge said, that this is an issue. But we're also talking about the same judge who said to the lawyers on our side that they couldn't refer to these athletes as being males. So right
Mm.
there, I think we're kind of set up for failure when you can't clarify what a person's truth is, their sex.
Yeah.
Mhm.
how,
And
how,
I
how do you
understand,
expect clarity when you have to confuse people with language like that?
one of those male athletes in Connecticut has been offered scholarships to Harvard and or West Point. But if he was
I
competing
can't
in the boys,
confirm that for
okay,
sure, but I
okay.
know they do have opportunities that were given to them that they wouldn't be afforded if they were racing as boys, because they couldn't cut it in boys. And
Yeah,
now they have,
okay.
athlete of the week and
Mhm.
women's athlete of the year records and things of that sort. So, and we do know that they pushed Selena Sewell out of a race where she would have raced in front of college recruiters. So right there
Mhm.
is losing scholarship opportunities.
But what does that teach girls? It teaches
Mhm.
them, well, what's the point? If they know they're going to be
Yeah.
competing against a biological male, it's like, what's the point? And we had evidence of that in New Zealand with that downhill mountain
We have
biking. When it comes
evidence
to
of that
nationals,
across the nation,
yeah,
across the world now,
yeah,
that we have young girls telling their moms, what's the point of me going when I just have to compete against this boy?
yeah. There was
Mhm.
only 6 female mountain bikers that turned up to nationals when the transgender rider was riding, because they all thought, what's the point? Yeah.
Wow.
So
I
you
mean,
take
Well,
away,
maybe it'll have to get to a point where we all don't show up on the starting line. And maybe that's what it's going to take to get the media's attention to show. I don't know. It would be sad for us to have to sacrifice our own sports, but in the end, if we sacrifice a race or two and we're preserving races for future generations, what's a little sacrifice to preserve what,
Mm,
you know, we know how hard the women before us fought to have what we have today. And
mhm.
we can sacrifice just a little to preserve that, right? And I think that's we're all what we all see that and we're all stepping up the way we have.
Well, we don't tolerate cheating in any other aspect. I mean, look at all the anti-doping laws and tribunals and all the
Exactly.
testing.
Exactly.
And, you know, we see someone like Lance Armstrong who was discovered cheating, and I mean, his reputation is ruined.
It
He will
highlights the
never be taken
absurdities
seriously
of
again.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
and
here,
I'm
but we're
really lucky that
tolerating
I
it here.
work with USA Powerlifting, that I lift with them because they see that they are a strictly drug tested federation and they've put their foot
Hmm.
down and said like, hey, this isn't much different than doping to allow this
Hmm.
male who's had this advantage to come into female sports, and they created laws and or rules to protect that, and now they're getting sued by a
Hmm.
transgender athlete for creating those rules. It's time for everyone to put their foot down. We're not going to
Hmm.
let them bully us because that's what they are trying to do. And I know
Well, we,
USA Powerlifting will not back down. They are not going to let males compete in the female
Good.
category. And that's awesome because there are not asterisks by the records that Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood and etc. that these male athletes are setting in these high schools to show future
Mhm.
generations of girls that really wasn't a girl that set that record. And no, they don't need to try harder. They're doing all they can. It's just that that was set by a boy.
Yeah.
Unrealistic
Mhm.
standards that we are setting our girls up for. We're setting up for failure, unrealistic standards. We're telling them that their voices don't matter, etc., etc., etc. It's just,
Yeah.
isn't it crazy that we even are here? Isn't it absurd that we even need to be here?
Hmm.
It is.
And
Like
then,
I think generations of women thought that this fight had been fought,
Yeah,
that we had fought for equity and that we were really pleased with where we got. There was still room to go. But we'd won the battle and it
we
was
were
just
getting there.
yeah,
mhm.
exactly. And this is just unwinds so much of what has been attained. It's ridiculous.
I feel like we
Well,
were swimming upstream and now we're like sucked into a tidal pool, or like, like we're in the current right now. It's like, what are they doing?
and we're getting men having, you know, two bites of the cherry as well. It's not just young men who are signing up because they couldn't compete to an elite level in their sport, but men who are now aging out of their sports. And
Yes,
then all of a sudden they're coming out as
it is a
trans. And
it's
there's
a
quite a
major
few
growing
examples.
part of this is
Yep.
mediocre males in middle to late life entering into
Hmm.
sports because we are seeing women in that age competing more and more. And they're not given a therapeutic use exemption for taking the hormones that they need to continue to be healthy after menopause. And yet these athletes are basically allowed to take a cocktail of drugs and age gracefully and maintain their athletic performances. And it's a huge deal.
Hmm.
It's going to be interesting after this Olympics whether the Olympics changes their policy. Like I know that they've done a whole lot of work behind the scenes on it, and they decided not to change it before this Olympics because people
Sure.
had already
Well,
died based
as
on that
you
policy.
guys know, we sent a letter to the Olympics, a petition with over 40 organizations from across the world that signed on to this petition to ask them to please change their rules. And that's exactly what they said, is that we'll look into it, but we can't do it before Tokyo because that wouldn't be fair.
So let's not worry about the
Fair to
unfairness to the
who?
female
Yeah.
athletes that are missing
But we'll
out.
take it. We'll take it, right? And
Uh,
hopefully we'll be given a seat at the table when they do have that discussion, and they won't just rely on some research from a transgender athlete that's self-reported from
and
less
it's
than
actually
10
really
people.
important because all of these other policies from other sporting organizations have flowed down from that.
They're looking up
Yes.
to the IOC, and the IOC
Yeah.
is looking at profits over people, and it's time for that to change. They need to
Mhm.
see what they are doing to society here with these laws because everyone is looking up to them. And pretty soon they will not have athletes being fed into their system of Olympics. Pretty soon it's
Mhm.
just going to be men's Olympics.
Go
Maybe that's
back to
what we
what it
need to
was.
do. Maybe we need to create our own Olympics again and just do our own
All
thing as
over
women,
again.
all over again.
Yeah. Mm.
Well, we don't know exactly what it's going to take, but what we do know now is it is a time to be on defense and to preserve what we have and to make people aware. So I'm really grateful that you ladies took the time and that we could arrange this. We have quite the difference with New Zealand, Australia, Minnesota in times here. I'm glad we could accommodate it. And luckily, I'm a night owl. So I hope that we can get again together to give everyone an update in the future. Are there any words you want to close with, Ro?
No, I guess just like if you are a Kiwi, like go to the Speak Up for Women site and sign the petition against the sex self ID because that will have real implications on sports if it goes through. And I guess follow our Save Women Sport Australasia Facebook page as well because we post regular updates on what's going on there. So it's a good way to get information, also find out what's going on. And when we do finally see the draft principles and policies from New Zealand Rugby Union and Sport New Zealand, we'll make sure we make people aware through that. And it'll probably be a good time to have a conversation again then too, Beth.
Super. Yes. Let us know for sure. Sure. Closing comments, Kath?
So I would like to say to people, if they have been affected, please contact us with their stories because we're trying to collate them. We're also got a petition in the works, a parliamentary petition that we will be launching soon. So we will be urging people to be aware of that, and we'll let you know when it happens, and you can come and sign it. And also keep getting in touch with your MPs, even as a private person. Write them a letter, make a phone call, ask for a meeting. You're entitled to do that. They need to know that people are concerned and that they're watching, and that we would like women to retain the integrity of our sports. So yes, be brave and speak up.
Exactly. And I encourage all our American followers to do the same. It was a pleasure to have you women in this space with me, and I look forward to speaking with you again. And I hope our courage calls to everyone out there. Until next time, signing out. Thanks for
Thanks, Beth.
joining.
Thanks, Beth.